has a question. Yes, Melissa?
I actually have two questions. Now I'm forced to choose. Well, maybe you want to answer it later because it might involve a back-end calculation. Some of the hardliners have argued that no deal is better than a bad deal. And regardless of whether you or not you feel this is a bad deal, can you imagine what Iran's program might be like in 15 years with no deal versus what it's like with this deal?
Well, I think I have the
if
numbers.
If you want to answer it later, that's fine.
Well, I can say this. I think they were enriching at making 20% at 0.15 kilograms per day. So now if we extrapolate that to the hundreds of days that have already passed since the JPOA, you get large numbers. So I think that's already scary enough. We can talk offline.
Other questions? Yeah, Sal?
So the agreement suggests that the two sides will talk about possible military dimensions. And this is one of those kind of hot button issues. It provides very little information about what they're actually going to, how they're going to explore that. It seems to me that there's a kind of a delicate situation here where you almost don't want Iran to reveal too much. If they reveal too much, I almost feel like it might undercut this. And I don't think for domestic purposes they can reveal too much, but you also need them to reveal something. So I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about what we might actually see and how this kind of thorny issue might get worked out in the coming months.
I mean, it's a one for you.
Delighted. I think one reason it's a little vague and something that complicates these discussions is that something that is to be worked out with the IAEA. So, in theory, the Iranians could say, yeah, we had a weapons program, we're really sorry about that, it's all closed up here. And the IAEA could say, well, we now understand and we're good, and so the resolution is in the hands of this separate entity, but of course, as you note, there's an enormous potential political problem, which is if the Iranians admit the... you should mute your thingy. If the Iranians admit the scope of the weapons program before 2003, and if it's as big as I think it is, right, that's going to be a real problem for the deal. So my guess is that the IAEA, there's going to be a really delicate balance between getting enough information so the IAEA feels like they understood what went on, but not, demanding the kind of admission out of the Iranians that would collapse things. But I have to say, people make a big deal about having clarity on the program before 2003 as being essential to verify the agreement. And I'm a little skeptical of that argument because I feel like we have pretty good clarity, right? I mean, the Iranians can scream, oh, that document's a falsification, or oh, that signals intelligence is fake, but we know it's not fake. And so, that it's not really clear to me how necessary it is that they admit what we know they did. I mean, I just think we want to get to a point where we have a bulk of information so the IAEA can say that it has a complete picture. And so, well, I'll let Avner go.
I have a slightly different take on that. I think I'm more cynical on that. I mean, usually I'm not, but on this, I think it's a way to let Iran off the hook. It's a sensitive, thorny issue that you don't want to deal with it in a way to... I mean, my proposed idea would be perhaps, and I don't like it in general, but perhaps to create a classified way to push on the things that you collect that kind of information. The information, most of it is beyond 2003 and before 2003, but there are still questions about after 2003. It's not the entire story. And to let that activities to essentially to wash them out as if it's almost nothing, I think it's a wrong signal. So that's one of the things we desire to have. And indeed, it was far from being agreed. I mean, there are still issues, and it's not clear how. I see it ultimately as allowing to run hook to hook, but maybe it will be a contention issue that's not going to be easily resolved.
All right, so finally a little disagreement on the panel, I think.
I think we have a lot of disagreement.
Yeah.
It's just
it hasn't come out yet. Well, let's if you guys
but we're not arguing.
Unmute in the overflow room. We can take a question from the other room if somebody has one.
Yeah, hi, this is Sharad.
Hi, Sharad.
Hi. Feel free to reject this question, but if you look, but I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on the broader context. I mean, does anyone expect this agreement to affect either, well, hopefully positively, the broader tensions regarding Iran in the Middle East, whether it's state sponsorship or all sorts of other historical issues?
No.
Maybe give that one to Avner for first swing.
Well, I think that the whole business about 10, 15, 20 years is the hope that Iran within that kind of period of time will change, and ultimately it will give you some time for realignment. It's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be looked as betrayal with the Sunni Arabs in the Gulf or Saudi Arabia itself or Israel, but it will be a way, some time to realign. Again, I think it's a gamble on time, but I think without fundamental change in the relationship over time, if Iran is going to be in 10, 15 years the Iran of today, I'm not even talking about Iran under Ahmadinejad, but Iran of today, there are real problems. So I think the hope is that Iran would transcend, would evolve to something different, and we need time.
So Amy Sands has a hand up.
So I have a question that I think is for the two Jeffs, actually, both, now that I know that having taught this semester with Jeff, he's an expert on how the U.S. government works here. So how is this going to be set up? I mean, are we going to have a special verification commission in Geneva or Vienna that has the EU +3+1, or is this going to, or will it be, I don't know. I'm curious what your thinking is in terms of how this will set up for implementation, because that's sort of critical, actually. And you can't keep having your Secretary of State spending weeks in Europe. So, I mean, I assume that some of the key negotiators will get re-engaged as the implementers. But what will be the actual structure?
Yeah, so I think virtually all of the verification will be done by the IAEA. That's the wording in the fact sheet.
But will it go to the board?
So the Security Council will pass a resolution that endorses the deal, cancels out the existing sanctions, leaves in place sanctions that are related to other things. The IAEA will do all of the verification, and there will be the one area that's unclear to me is there's going to be a dispute resolution mechanism. And that's all they say. I presume that is a dispute resolution mechanism that will be between the E3, EU +3, and the Iranians. But I have not seen any explanation for how that would interact with the IAEA board or the Security Council. So that's the part that to me is a little bit interesting.
Do you think the IAEA will be asked to do the procurement channel monitoring? Or do you think that'll be separate?
I don't know. That was my expectation.
Okay.
I have a slightly dissent view. I think this issue has not been fully settled. The IAEA is the default. Of course, it's easy to go that way. I think it's not clear. You know, there was, under the IAEA, when the Iraq thing, at one time there was special commission dealt with Iran as a special body. Another time there was the Iraqi file within the IAEA. I think the issue has not been settled, and I think it still could be a form of dispute. I think Jeffrey is right in the sense that if it's going to be the IAEA, they will have to learn and to understand conceptually and practically a lot of issues that they have not done before.
So my other part of that question was, how does the U.S. interface with that, specifically given the congressional concerns here and willingness to be just block things?
To me, I'm with Jeffrey in that I think that the IAEA will retain the primary responsibility for verification. There's always been issues about the modalities for sharing national intelligence with the IAEA, and those are going to have to get worked out.
So those have been pretty much worked out. I mean, it flows pretty comfortably these days. I mean, I don't know what it is exactly. I just know from where it was in 1991 and 2, it's come an enormous distance. And that doesn't seem to be an issue to the folks I'm talking to in the intelligence community. And there are other countries now that provide, it's more comfortable all around.
Several of us, Amy and I, are co-teaching a class on policymaking and intelligence in the non-proliferation realm, and we talked a little bit in our class this morning about this, but I think what you suggested is probably right. There will be some special task force set up across the different components of the intelligence community in the U.S. that will be specially charged with monitoring this agreement, and then the question will be, how does that entity interface with the other P5+1 countries in the IAEA?
And I should say, I mean, we've relied exclusively on the IAEA to report on their compliance with the interim agreement, and then, you know, again, it's just the fact sheet, but every place in the fact sheet that mentions verification uses either IAEA or inspectors in the context of the IAEA.
But the IAEA is not an expert on the procurement channels. I think that's going to be, they have to learn a lot.
That may be a complicated, I mean, and for all I know, the Iranians will show up and say, no, I don't want to do it through the IAEA, we want to do it through the Security Council. That's not discussed. So
I see a couple of what I'm going to assume are two fingers here rather than new questions. So Drew?
So this is sort of related. I mean, a lot of UN Security Council resolutions sort of establish committees to sort of monitor the implementation of those resolutions. I wonder, I haven't seen anything yet written, and I discussed with Robert about this, if there's going to be a committee associated with this new Security Council resolution, which is going to codify, and what that committee might do, and if that committee might have a role to play.
Has not been decided.
I know the people on the sanctions committee have no idea what their role will be.
But that is a logical possibility. George, was you also a two-finger?
I was going to maybe make a comment. I mean, the IAEA has almost no expertise in nuclear weapons whatsoever. That's
how it's
true.
supposed to be said.
And you know, there's a lot of reliance being placed on IAEA inspection in this whole regime, and unless the IAEA inspectors are upgraded or somehow given training in a lot of things that they don't normally do.
I don't see why that would be the case, though, because what they're verifying are numerical limits on centrifuges, the piping. They're not verifying weapons design.
Who's going to be doing the advanced protocol, looking for undeclared sites and indicators of a weapons program? It's certainly not the expertise of the IAEA.
Right, but what they're called on to do is to visit a site if it becomes an issue, and they certainly can look at a site and tell you if it's suitable for a centrifuge.
They're the ones under the advanced protocol who make the determination as to whether additional protocol who make the decision as to whether the site should be.
But they do that now, right? I mean, they're the ones who've sought access to Parchin. I just don't understand.
That's because somebody told them to go look at Parchin.
What, somebody will tell them again.
But that's I think that's what's envisioned in this agreement is right. What the agreement gives is the IAEA the right to go look at the site, but of course it'll be either the E3 or one of the +3, right, that will say to the IAEA, we have a problem, this is a site.
And the Iranians just said that they're not going to allow anybody to go to military sites.
That's not exactly what he said.
I'm just waiting for the wedding invitation that says to you and your +3. So I handed it back, that's been waiting for a while.
Thanks.
It's a long story.
So some of you in the room know that I've been socialising a paper on the architecture for the procurement channel. And there's a bit of a backstory to that, but one specific issue that needs thought through, and it helps, I think, determine thinking on how you structure this, is with regards to ballistic missiles. So in the framework, it implies that the sanctions will continue to be in place on the ballistic missile procurement, at least, and probably prohibiting, therefore, the development of the programme. The challenge that I foresee is that has to be then UN sanctions. Iran won't be able to buy things for the ballistic missile program through the procurement channel, of course, and so Iran could therefore engage in illicit trade. If you've got Iran engaging in illicit trade for missile-relevant technologies, some of which could be used for a nuclear end use, then you've got a real issue with regards to illicit trade outside of the channel, and then the question of who does that. Certainly, looking at interdictions is not something that the IAEA would do if it's outside of Iran. So then you need a panel of experts like you currently have for the sanctions and so on. So I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on the BM aspect of this and how it relates to the nuclear aspect.
This is going to be incredibly hard. I mean, I don't think there's a flip answer to it. I just think it will be. I'm just thinking about the cylindrical grinders that went to Burma, right? Yeah, I mean the only thing I could think is that, and they haven't defined the procurement channel. My expectation will be that the procurement channel will include end user measures, and so presumably the Iranians will have to declare the purpose of the import, and there will be some ability to check up to make sure that the controlled good ends up at the right place. But even then, like, what do you do with that carbon fiber plant?
Missile stuff, so you can't verify this for missile inducers.
Right. Well, and even if they say, oh, we're importing it from the nuclear program because we got the carbon fiber and we're going to put it at the carbon fiber plant, but then you don't know where the material ends up. So that's.
And for the Iranians, the
gonna be a
whole
problem.
missile issue is off the things. It's completely.
Did you want to add anything on
No,
that? You're good. Let me see if there's, again, check with the overflow room. Any other questions from back there? Going once, going twice? And how about Moira?
Yeah, I want to refer to a throwaway comment that Jeffrey Lewis made a little while back.
Are any of your comments throwaway comments?
Just about
Only how other people view
you,
them.
you made a reference to other sanctions programs. Do you remember that? I don't know about this.
Human rights or
Yeah, right.
financing terrorism.
Right. Well, missile proliferation, right.
Right, but so, Iran is still supporting Hezbollah.
Right.
Okay, there's still human rights issues.
Right.
And so,
Those sanctions in the U.S. stay on.
so it doesn't sound like anything's going to change
What do you mean by anything?
in terms of the sanctions program.
Different sanctions are
different
different levels of
reasons.
severity.
So, for example, the guys from the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran are going to be able to get visas now. Right? I mean, that's a sort of...
But in terms of trade and investment, nothing is going to change.
We need sanctions experts.
Well, no, I mean, sorry, no, I'm hesitating for, like, when you say nothing is going to change, you're presuming that there's a particular change you care about. Like, I don't...
Well, for example,
yeah, go ahead.
U.S. companies up until 2002 lobbied very heavily to have those sanctions on Iran removed because they were losing out in billions of dollars worth of contracts to the Japanese, to the Europeans, and later on the Chinese. But and the Europeans already have a head start in trying to or put together deals that can go into place, after all of these negotiations are successfully concluded. U.S. companies, it sounds like they are still going to be shut out.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the Iranians continue to engage in terrorism and proliferate ballistic missiles. I mean, I guess, sorry, the way that I look at the agreement is my goal, and I think the goal of the administration, was to get as much of a constraint on the Iranian program for the smallest amount of sanctions relief possible.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't think there's this is not a Cuba deal where the goal is to recreate the relationship.
I know that. I
Yeah.
know that. But we have had multilateral sanctions in place for a little while, but now it's going to go back to unilateral sanctions. Essentially, is what's going to happen. That's what it sounds like.
Okay,
That's fair.
And the only person that hurt, only actors that hurts are U.S. businesses.
okay. I don't. I mean,
I just wanted to confirm that. Okay.
Yeah,
I think she's raising a really important issue. I mean, I don't know enough about the sanctions regime. My impression is there are some targeted sanctions that will be lifted relative to the energy sector. So I think American companies actually are keen, if this is finalized, to be able to engage. But I don't know the nuances of that.
Robert,
but it is.
do you know?
Does anyone know?
Yeah, I can shed some light on this, or maybe,
Go ahead.
or I don't know, it may end up, providing less clarity. I mean, but the in the fact sheet that was issued by the Obama administration, there's a statement of U.S. and EU nuclear-related sanctions, and that's it. And so, from the standpoint, and this is, I think, sort of echoing what Moderator was driving at, is that the question for U.S. companies, but I think also multinational companies that have either U.S. operations or are dealing with U.S. origin goods and technologies, is going to be, what does nuclear-related mean? And we've actually gotten that question here from industry. I've received that via Kevin Cuddy. That's sort of the big GE. That's a big question right now, is what is nuclear-related. And if you look at this from the sort of U.S. regulatory framework, and again, I think this is Moyar, this is what you were driving at, is there's a myriad of statutes and executive orders that are referencing multiple reasons for sanctions, multiple reasons for control. And at least within a U.S. regulatory context, it is going to be extremely difficult to extract nuclear-related sanctions from these. I don't think it's impossible, but it's going to be a lot of work, very simply. At the heart of the sanctions as they're implemented in the U.S. regulatory framework today, there's really sort of two primary vehicles. You have the Iranian sanctions, transactions and sanctions regulations, which deal mainly with goods and technologies, and then you have the Iranian financial sanctions regulations. And then it's not a perfect analogy, but you have orbiting this, a series of executive orders. But each of these sets of regulations, if you look at the legal authority, it's a mix. There's a whole range of statutes in EOs that are being referenced. And if you look at the individual statutes and EOs, you'll see typically nuclear non-proliferation, terrorism, human rights mentioned together in the same statute or in the same executive order. So it's going to be very challenging. One window into this is that when the plan of action was introduced, there was a set of these that were, in a sense, rolled back. But they were precise enough and limited enough it could be done. But it was still, there was quite a bit of work involved in that. And each of the specific regulatory passages and executive orders all had to be impacted by this. There's a nice document that was issued by the Congressional Research Service in February that kind of presents a map of this, but it's also, if anything, it's an illustration of how difficult this will be, because you'll have the individual statutes, you have the executive orders, and you have the, quote, reasons for control. And typically you'll see there non-proliferation, terrorism, human rights, they're all referenced. So this is a big question for U.S. industry, but also multinational companies. And then there's also, sort of bring this, I think, again, back to Moyar's comments, there's a question of, okay, if a transaction involving a dual-use good is authorized, how is that going to be financed? And how do you extract that financial authorization from sanctions that are in place for multiple reasons, especially in the U.S., which carries so much weight in the financial community? So I guess that's my... So
lawyers are going to make a lot of money out of it.
There you go.
I was going to say something more optimistic. Yeah. Hopefully jobs for graduates of our program who've taken Robert's and Moyara's classes. Robert, while you have the floor, let me ask you a follow-up question. Some of the sanctions imposed by the U.S. are a product of executive orders. Some are products of congressional legislation. Some of the congressional legislation has options for presidential waivers. Assuming that there's some slice of sanctions relief that's nuclear related that the United States can do you have a sense for how much of it President Obama can do on his own and how much will require affirmative action of some kind by Congress?
I think there's a fair amount that can be done through executive order. There are some provisions within the sanctions regulations as administered by Treasury that do allow for waivers of licensing requirements, and it's very generally wording, but there can be just a waiver given, and so that can be one mechanism. And then, as noted, some of the statutes do allow for the president to waive certain provisions or suspend certain provisions. And I think we saw some of this with the joint plan of action. I mean, again, this is one of these where you have to literally go through each statute, each executive order, and look at what's possible and what isn't. There's going to be some convenient on-off switches there, and then there are going to be some where, you're probably going to have to go back to Congress and ask for something.
I mean, my understanding is the administration, and we'd have to go back and, I hate to say all, because, invariably there will be one, but virtually every sanctions legislation I've ever seen includes a presidential waiver. And so the administration, the people I've talked to, seem very confident that between the whatever the Security Council does, right, in terms of striking certain sanctions, which will make the Iranians happy, that they can then waive without going to Congress for all of the stuff that they plan on delivering.
I believe some of these waivers, though, may require certain certifications, such as,
Sure, but
human rights, terrorism, and so forth.
Well, they just certified that Venezuela is a national security threat, so I mean, at that point, there's nothing they're not willing to say.
But usually, I'd have to go back and look at each of them, but my recollection is usually when I look at sanctions legislation, the president has a sort of overarching national security interest waiver.
It's usually,
which is how the Pakistanis got the waiver every year while they were happily building a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. I don't think that's true in 100% of the cases, but I too would have to go back and actually sort of go through them. But you are correct, is that many of these do have especially the legislation, the statute has a presidential waiver itself.
And I guess the thing I really want to emphasize is my understanding is the administration plans to do this just through waivers, that they're not counting on congressional action.
That would be, if and again, that sort of quote on-off switch is available, that will be the quickest path to ensuring that you can have the quote-unquote snapback.
Yeah.
That allows you to back.
Well, and the fact sheet hints at this because what it says is the architecture of sanctions will remain in place. So it means that they're not going to ask Congress to remove the architecture.
That's a key point. Yeah, I noticed the same thing. When you see architecture, that's a signal you're going to see this structure. It's so multi-layered in the U.S. context. It's not to diminish the EU context, by the way. I mean, there's certainly provisions in place there, but the U.S. It's just multi-layered.
Well, thank you very much for our unacknowledged fourth panelist, shadow panelist. Yes,
fourth panelist, the fifth beetle.
Yes, yes. So I think we hold the room for about 10 more minutes. So I'm happy to take probably one or two more questions. Yeah, Mark.
Question: If there's a deal and sanctions are removed, and you see Russia and China developing a commercial relationship with Iran, say on oil, and then eventually there's a question about Iranian compliance about something. Do you see a problem with Russia or China? I would say looking the other way, but less eager to enforce because of that new relationship, that new economic relationship?
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I mean, one of the you will always, Security Councils like this. Getting sanctions on, it's a miracle when you do, and if you take them off, it's, you really can't expect that you'll get them back. So I think you have to assume that the value of the deal is in the incentives it creates for the Iranians to comply in the first place, and you've got to count on being willing to enforce the agreement yourself if you can't get the Security Council to act. And I don't think anybody's enthusiastic about the prospect of striking the Iranians, but without that threat, I would not rely solely on the Security Council to reimpose sanctions. Although I mean, it's not an impossible thing to imagine, but could be difficult.
It's sort of interesting to me because most of the comments made by the panelists and the tenor of most of the questions have been heavily on what I think of as sort of the technical side of this. How much constraint does this place on Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons? What are the mechanics of the inspections and the sanctions relief and so forth? On most of the technical questions, I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, I think this was a very good deal. Don't think the Iranians agreed to this unless they have some fairly serious intentions behind it. But the politics of this are, Ferenc's chart is easy block letters compared to the chart of the politics of this. So just on the issue of, suppose there's non-compliance 5 years from now, but Russia and China are very happily doing tons of business with Iran. I mean, you get these elaborate, complicated calculations that everybody has to make. Then, if Russia and China just blow off the whole agreement and don't vote for enforcement, does that mean that the United States or Israel go back to talking about military strikes on Iran in order to preclude that? Do you have to be willing to enforce? You know, everybody's going to be doing advanced calculus of politics to try to figure this out as this moves forward. I mean, I think it's a very good deal, and I'm optimistic that if the deal is implemented, it will be very likely successful from a non-proliferation point of view. I'm fairly pessimistic that it will ever happen because I can tell myself 100 different stories about politically how this will fail to ever get off the ground, and I can't tell myself a story about how it succeeds.
Yeah, the most you can hope for is it will fail in a new and interesting way.
Yeah, lots of case studies for us to write
So we'll
5
have
years
another
from
meeting.
now. Yeah. Yes. Jonathan.
I wanted to ask, I've heard this idea kind of floated around, that this kind of sets a precedence of kind of a 1-year breakout being acceptable now under the NPT. I just wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on this.
Do you want to go first? Because I think you're going to find it sympathetic, and I hate this argument.
It's highly problematic. For the first time, essentially, you put that kind of, it's not exactly provision, but it's a normative aspect. Essentially, you give country a kind of pass if it's more than 12 months, or what you estimate is more than. So it's problematic. Mm-hmm. There is another interesting normative aspect of that is, and there was very little attention to that either in the media or even by the expert. And this is the establishment of the precedent that a country such as Iran, but could be in the future somebody else, cannot decide on its own how it's going to interpret the NPT and just follow that. The world has a role, and ultimately the decision would be as a result of negotiation. Otherwise, could be a threats of all the way up to military attack. In other words, the interpretation of the NPT, and the NPT is full of ambiguities, is not up to sovereign nations. It's ultimately you negotiate with some kind of body to get legitimacy. And I think that's this was not the case with Japan. Because Japan ultimately, even though everybody acknowledged that it was quite extraordinary, it was through the usual system of the NPT, safeguard agreement, and all that kind of thing. But in the case of Iran, it was agreed. Iran is not the body to decide on its own. And Iran ultimately accepted that. And I think that's interesting normatively speaking.
Yeah, and I think the reason that I just find this argument about changing the implicit terms of the NPT so frustrating. First of all, I find it interesting when we talk about symbolism of things, that's usually because the terms are really good. You can't complain about the terms, so you complain about what the terms might theoretically mean. And I just, like, it is a good deal that puts a verifiable gap between Iran's bomb option and the decision to exercise that option. And so, for me, there are all kinds of states in the NPT that had bomb programs and that still have research that we would freak out if the Iranians did. I mean, if the Iranians recreated Sweden's, forget what they call it, but basically the Swedish latent bomb program, the one that still trains people to design nuclear weapons, we would be beside ourselves.
Defensive research or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, but that program was not truly active after 1970.
You should talk to the people
I
still produce.
There was some theoretically, semi-theoretically.
They continue to you should look at the public radio chemistry.
I know the story, but it was not a program in the full active sense.
Yes, it absolutely was. That had an actual bomb design. People who know how to build
bomb design is not.
Before we go down this.
Well, anyway, stop. I get to finish.
You do?
Yes, I do. So the point being that
you don't have rights, you're privileged.
Yeah, that's true. I'm going to assert a right like I'm in the Iranians. All kinds of states have these capabilities, right? And what the NPT says is that you don't have a right to possess or manufacture. And Iran doesn't really end up with a special case in a positive sense, right? The Supreme Leader's red line was that Iran not be a special case, that it be a normal NPT state. And the only way that it's special under this deal is that it's subject to enhanced scrutiny and additional complications. And so we're delighted when, for example, the UAE renounces reprocessing, right? And we don't say that undermines the NPT, but when the Iranians do, and I'm not saying sort of Avner does this, but then people come around and say, oh, well, that's special treatment for the Iranians. I mean, I think it's only special treatment in a way that the Supreme Leader is going to have to explain away why it doesn't cross his red line.
I mean, I would give a slightly different answer. Special treatment's part of the regime. We have a global nuclear non-proliferation regime, and it has many pieces to it. It has pieces that are legalized and global. It has pieces that are sort of semi-formal and semi-legitimate, but basically accepted, like the export control regimes. It has things which are strictly bilateral, various U.S. security guarantees to allies, right? And then it has special side deals for countries that aren't quite willing to participate in the regime without a little special treatment. And I guess if I think of the various special deals that have existed over time, you know, the agreed framework with North Korea or the US-India nuclear deal, you know, those other two created much more problematic precedents than this one. I mean, you know, the agreed framework created this sort of enormous moral hazard where it's like, you know, try to break out of the NPT and people shower you with goodies. I mean, the US-India deal, just you know, have a nuclear weapon program that you know, you're just don't join the NPT at all, and you'll get all the same privileges as an NPT member. I mean, this is a much less good deal than either of those two. So I don't.
Much less bad deal.
Yes, but from the non-proliferation regime point of view, it's a much less bad deal. So yes, it's special treatment for Iran, but it doesn't worry me that much. Thanks.
Let me simplify it for the technical person, because I don't understand all the political arguments. If you think about it, any country that has an enrichment plant on their property and they want to produce enough for one reactor. Again, coming back to the marathon analogy. If you produce enough enriched material for one reactor, that's the marathon. That's different from what I was saying before. That's the marathon, to produce one reactor. It's only 1 mile in that you're at the level where you can produce a bomb. That's how serious it is. And that's why I would say any country that has enrichment facilities on their, you know, on their property is a threshold state, a state that would want to hedge for, could hedge for nuclear weapons.
All right, I think we are out of time, but this was an exceptionally stimulating and informative panel, and please join me in thanking our official and unofficial contributors.